My new manager fired me because he thought I was just another senior employee. He never bothered to learn that I was the only person who truly understood the systems keeping our biggest clients online. He told me the company needed people who could adapt faster. I simply thanked him for the opportunity, packed my desk and walked away. 3 weeks later, he was asking if I would consider coming back. But by then things had changed. I still remember the morning Daniel Carter arrived. The entire engineering department had been asked to gather in the largest conference room before 9. Nobody knew much about him except that corporate headquarters had hired him after replacing our previous vice president of operations, who had retired after nearly 15 years. Daniel entered with the confidence of someone who had already decided. He was the smartest person in the building. Perfect navy suit. Expensive watch. Confident smile. He shook a few hands, introduced himself, and immediately walked to the front of the room. "I'm not here to maintain old habits," he announced. "I'm here to build a high-performance culture." People exchanged polite smiles. We had heard speeches like this before. Every executive wanted to be remembered for changing something. Very few wanted to understand why things worked in the first place. "I'm going to eliminate unnecessary processes," Daniel continued. "Too much experience often becomes resistance to innovation." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it offended me, because it revealed exactly how he thought. To him, experience wasn't knowledge. It was an obstacle. I had worked at Atlas Data Solutions for nearly 11 years. During that time, I'd helped migrate thousands of enterprise clients onto our cloud infrastructure. I had designed the internal monitoring framework our support teams relied on every single day. Whenever a critical customer experienced a system failure, my phone was usually the first one that rang. Not because I had the highest title, because people knew I'd find the answer. Titles never interested me. Problems did. The first month after Daniel arrived felt strangely familiar. He scheduled meeting after meeting. Every presentation included words like transformation, optimization, agility, disruption. Yet every discussion became less about solving technical problems and more about making impressive slides. Weekly engineering reviews disappeared. Instead, we spent hours explaining progress using colorful dashboards that told executives exactly what they wanted to hear. Everything looked healthy, until something actually broke. One afternoon, our largest healthcare client experienced intermittent authentication failures. Support escalated the issue. Developers blamed networking. Networking blamed infrastructure. Infrastructure blamed security. After 2 hours of confusion, one of the junior engineers quietly walked to my desk. "Claire, could you take a look?" Within 15 minutes I found the problem. A routine configuration update had triggered a conflict inside an older authentication service that almost nobody remembered existed. Except me. I had helped build it years earlier. The outage was resolved before the client noticed the full impact. No celebration. No recognition. Just another crisis avoided. The next morning, Daniel congratulated the project managers for excellent cross-functional coordination. My name never came up. That wasn't unusual. The best work inside large companies is often invisible. If everything functions perfectly, executives assume nothing important happened. A few weeks later, Daniel introduced another initiative. Every department would undergo what he called a talent efficiency review. Nobody liked the sound of that. Within days, several experienced employees disappeared. One database administrator with 18 years of experience accepted an early retirement package. A cybersecurity specialist left after being told his role overlapped with another team. 2 senior analysts resigned voluntarily. Each departure was explained as part of modernization. Yet every person leaving happened to possess years of institutional knowledge that couldn't be documented in a spreadsheet. I began saving copies of my project documentation at home. Nothing confidential. Only records of my own work, architecture diagrams I had personally created, training materials I'd written, and emails confirming decisions made over the years. Experience had taught me something simple. Whenever leadership starts talking about efficiency, documentation becomes your best insurance. Daniel rarely spoke directly to engineers. Instead, he relied on reports prepared by middle managers. Numbers, charts, productivity metrics. He believed every employee could be measured by dashboards. One afternoon he finally visited our floor. He stopped beside my desk. "You've been here quite a while, right?" "Almost 11 years. He nodded. "That's impressive." There was a pause. Then he smiled politely. "Sometimes long tenure creates comfort." I looked at him. "Sometimes it creates expertise." His smile faded for a fraction of a second before returning. "I'm sure." He continued walking. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But it told me everything. He wasn't interested in understanding what I actually did. He had already decided who I was. The workload continued growing. Ironically, every efficiency improvement created additional work. Processes became more complicated. Approvals required more signatures. Simple technical decisions suddenly needed executive presentations. The engineers joked that we spent more time explaining our work than doing it. Nobody laughed very hard, because it was true. Late one Thursday evening, I stayed after most people had gone home. One of our largest financial clients planned a major migration over the weekend. I reviewed every checklist personally. Backups, rollback procedures, monitoring thresholds, emergency contacts. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan from infrastructure walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You should probably go home." "So should you." He smiled. "Fair point." We sat in silence for a moment. Finally he sighed. "You think these layoffs are finished?" "I don't." "You." "I think Daniel believes experience costs too much." Ethan stared into his coffee. "My dad always says companies only realize someone's value after they're gone." I smiled. I hope he's wrong. Neither of us believed it. The following Monday morning, an invitation appeared on my calendar. Meeting. Organizational alignment. Participants. Daniel Carter, Human Resources. 30 minutes. No agenda. No explanation. I looked at the screen for several seconds. Then I quietly closed my laptop. Some meetings announce themselves long before anyone says a word. And deep down, I already knew exactly what was waiting for me. I wasn't nervous when I walked into the conference room. Maybe I should have been. After all, people usually know exactly what a meeting with human resources means when it's scheduled without explanation. But after more than a decade in corporate life, you learn something important. Fear rarely changes the outcome. Preparation does. Daniel was already sitting at the table when I arrived. Melissa from HR offered a practiced smile that looked as though she'd repeated it hundreds of times before. "Good morning, Claire." I nodded politely. Daniel folded his hands. "Please have a seat." The room felt strangely quiet. No small talk. No questions about current projects. No discussion about the migration we'd completed successfully over the weekend. Daniel cleared his throat. "As part of our organizational restructuring, we've evaluated several leadership positions." There it was. Corporate language. Soft enough to sound professional. Cold enough to change someone's life. "We've decided to eliminate your current role." Melissa slid a folder across the table. "Your employment will end effective today." I looked down at the papers without opening them. Severance. Benefits. Equipment return. Everything neatly prepared long before I entered the room. "So that's it?" I asked calmly. Daniel nodded. "We appreciate your years of service." Years. As though 11 years could be summarized in a single sentence. "We're moving toward a more streamlined engineering model." "I see. We believe responsibilities can be distributed across multiple teams." That sentence almost made me smile. Distributed. He honestly believed the knowledge accumulated over 11 years could simply be divided into smaller pieces and assigned to different people. Knowledge doesn't work that way. Neither does trust. "I hope you understand this isn't personal," Daniel continued. "It's purely a business decision." I finally looked directly at him. "Can I ask one question?" "Of course." "Who will become technical owner for the client integration platform?" He frowned slightly. "I assume engineering will determine that." "No specific person?" "We have plenty of capable engineers." I nodded slowly. "They're talented people." That part was true. "They'll do their best." Daniel interpreted my answer as agreement. "I appreciate your professionalism." Professionalism. Interesting word. Apparently it meant accepting poor decisions without making anyone uncomfortable. Melissa explained the paperwork while I signed where necessary. No arguments. No emotional speeches. No dramatic exit. Just signatures. When everything was finished, Daniel stood. I genuinely wish you success. I shook his hand. So do I. Packing my desk took less than 20 minutes. A framed photograph from a hiking trip. 2 notebooks. Noise-canceling headphones. A coffee mug that read "Keep it simple." The plant beside my monitor had somehow survived 5 office renovations. I decided it deserved a better home. People noticed. Of course they did. Open offices have a way of broadcasting bad news before anyone says a word. Several coworkers walked over quietly. Some hugged me. Others simply shook my hand. Nobody knew what to say. It's ridiculous, Ethan whispered. I smiled. It happens. No. He shook his head. It shouldn't. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. Before leaving, I opened my inbox one last time. There were over 80 unread emails. Most involved projects I would never see completed. I forwarded exactly 3 messages to my personal email. Not company information. Not confidential files. Simply copies of documents I personally authored years earlier, technical standards, disaster recovery procedures, and architecture notes that were already part of my professional portfolio. Everything else stayed exactly where it belonged. I believed in leaving cleanly, even when the company didn't. At the security desk, I handed over my access badge. The guard looked surprised. Leaving already? I guess so. He hesitated. You were always the one coming in early. I laughed softly. Someone else will have to unlock the coffee machine now. For the first time that day, someone genuinely smiled. Driving home felt surreal. For 11 years my weekdays had followed almost exactly the same rhythm. Morning traffic. Coffee. Stand-up meeting. Code reviews. Customer calls. Late-night problem solving. Suddenly, none of it belonged to me anymore. I parked outside my apartment but stayed inside the car for nearly 15 minutes. Not because I wanted my job back. Because I needed time to separate my identity from the company. Too many people confuse the two. A job is something you do. It should never become who you are. The following morning, I woke up at 6 out of habit. For several seconds I reached for my phone, expecting overnight alerts from our monitoring system. Nothing. No notifications. No emergency messages. No client escalations. The silence felt unfamiliar. Instead of opening my work laptop, I made breakfast and sat on the balcony with a notebook. For the first time in years, there was no meeting waiting for me. No deadline. No executive presentation. Just quiet. Around 10 my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. You busy? Not particularly. You should know. He hesitated. Things are getting weird. What happened? They've assigned ownership of your systems to 4 different managers. I couldn't help smiling. 4? Yeah. Nobody seems to know who's actually responsible. I leaned back. That's unfortunate. It gets worse. He lowered his voice. The financial migration you prepared last week. What about it? They're trying to modify the deployment schedule. Without reviewing the dependency documentation? Silence. You already know, don't you? I have a guess. They can't even find half the documentation. I closed my eyes for a second. I left everything in the project repository. We know. They don't know where to look. That didn't surprise me. Documentation only helps people who bother reading it. Over the next several days, more messages arrived. Not official ones. Friends from different departments. Small questions at first. Where did you store the recovery templates? Do you remember why Client Horizon uses a separate authentication flow? Is there a reason this monitoring alert was disabled 3 years ago? I answered carefully. Only general guidance. Nothing confidential. Nothing belonging to the company. Just enough to help people avoid making unnecessary mistakes. Because my coworkers hadn't fired me. Leadership had. Friday afternoon my phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar corporate number. I answered. Hello? There was a brief pause. Then I recognized the voice immediately. Claire. It was Daniel. He sounded very different from the confident executive who had dismissed me only 4 days earlier. Measured, careful, almost cautious. I was wondering if you might have some time to discuss a few operational questions. I looked out across the city through my apartment window. The silence on my end lasted just long enough for him to realize something had changed. He no longer controlled the conversation. And for the first time since he'd arrived, he was the one asking for help. Of course, I said. What would you like to discuss? Daniel cleared his throat. There are a few systems we're trying to understand. I assumed the transition plan covered everything. It mostly did. Mostly. Interesting choice of words. The engineering team has run into several questions. I'm sure they'll figure them out. Another pause. I was hoping you could stop by the office for an hour. As an employee? No. As someone familiar with the environment. I smiled to myself. 5 days earlier I had been considered unnecessary. Now I was suddenly someone familiar with the environment. I'm afraid I can't provide technical guidance for free, I replied. I no longer work there. I understand. His voice remained polite, but I could hear the pressure underneath it. If necessary, we can discuss a consulting agreement. There it is. I'm sorry. The right conversation. Silence filled the call. Then Daniel asked quietly, what would it take? I'd need to understand the scope first. The scope? Exactly. What problem are we solving? He hesitated. Several. That answer told me everything. Large companies rarely call former employees after a few minor inconveniences. They call when multiple small problems have started connecting into one large problem. Send me a list. I'll have someone prepare it. And Daniel. Yes? Please make sure it's complete. It will be. When the call ended, I made another cup of coffee. I wasn't excited. I wasn't angry. Mostly I was curious. The email arrived 2 hours later. 43 separate issues. I read through them slowly. Some were straightforward. Several deployment scripts had been modified without updating the monitoring rules. A reporting service was generating inconsistent financial data because 2 departments were using different configuration files. An overnight automation process had begun failing after someone removed what they believed was an obsolete validation step. None of these problems were catastrophic on their own, but together, they created uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads quickly inside organizations. The final page caught my attention. 3 enterprise customers had requested meetings after repeated delays. 1 contract renewal had been postponed. Another client had temporarily paused a planned expansion. That wasn't because the software had stopped working. It was because confidence had begun disappearing. In technology, trust is often more valuable than code. The following Monday, I drove back to Atlas. Walking through the lobby felt different. A week earlier, I had left carrying a cardboard box. This time I carried only a laptop and a notebook. The receptionist looked surprised. I didn't know you were coming back. I'm not. She smiled awkwardly. They're waiting upstairs. Several familiar faces greeted me in the engineering department. Some looked relieved. Others looked exhausted. Ethan met me near the elevators. I'm really glad you're here. I thought everything was under control. He laughed. You have no idea. As we walked toward a conference room, he quietly filled me in. 3 senior engineers were now responsible for work previously coordinated by 1 person. Managers kept changing priorities every other day. Documentation existed. Nobody had enough context to know which document actually applied. They're not bad engineers, Ethan said. They're drowning. I know. Daniel stood as I entered the room. This time there was no speech. No performance. No unnecessary confidence. Only a laptop filled with open spreadsheets. Thank you for coming. I took a seat. You mentioned consulting. Yes. We've prepared a temporary agreement. He slid a printed document across the table. I read every page carefully. Hourly compensation. Limited project scope. Independent contractor status. Reasonable terms. Then I reached the last page. 6 weeks. I looked up. This won't work. Daniel frowned. Why not? Because your problem isn't 6 weeks long. He remained silent. You don't need someone to fix servers. You need someone to rebuild processes. The room became very quiet. One director finally spoke. What do you mean? I opened my notebook. You've been treating symptoms. I wrote 4 short sentences on the whiteboard. No ownership. No technical priorities. Too many approvals. Knowledge spread without accountability. This, I said, pointing at the board, is why you're struggling. No single outage caused this. Hundreds of small management decisions did. Nobody interrupted, because everyone in the room knew it was true. For the next 2 hours we reviewed every major issue. Not by assigning blame, by tracing how each problem had started. Again and again the same pattern appeared. An experienced employee had left. Responsibilities had been divided. Documentation existed. Context disappeared. Daniel listened more than he spoke. Eventually he leaned back. I thought documentation was enough. It never is. Why? Because documents explain what? I closed my notebook. Experienced people explain why. Without the why, every future decision becomes a guess. Before the meeting ended, Daniel remained seated while everyone else slowly left the room. Finally he spoke. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. I underestimated what you contributed. Yes. I believed the role could simply be reassigned. It couldn't. I see that now. There was no anger in his voice anymore. Only honesty. I've spent my career improving efficiency. I know. But I confused efficiency with reducing headcount. I appreciated that admission. Most executives never say those words out loud. They're not the same thing, I replied. No. They aren't. As I walked toward the parking garage later that afternoon, Ethan caught up with me. So, how'd it go? They're listening now. He smiled. About time. I looked back at the office building. They're finally asking the right questions. What questions? I watched employees moving behind the glass windows. The ones they should have asked before letting experienced people walk out the door. Ethan nodded slowly. You think they'll actually change? I didn't answer immediately, because changing a company isn't about fixing one crisis. It's about changing the way people think. And that would be the hardest part of all. Over the next 3 months I spent 2 days a week at Atlas. Not because I wanted my old job back. Because I wanted to leave the company in a better position than I had found it. That surprised a lot of people. One manager asked me over lunch, after everything that happened. Why help us? I thought about the question for a moment. I'm not helping the people who made the decision to fire me. I'm helping the people who have to live with the consequences. There was a difference. A very important one. The first thing I changed wasn't the software. It was communication. Every critical system received one clearly identified technical owner. Not necessarily the smartest engineer. Not the most senior one. The person who understood the entire picture and accepted responsibility for it. We also created mandatory knowledge transfer sessions. Not presentations. Real conversations. Engineers explained why decisions had been made years earlier, what alternatives had been rejected, and which shortcuts should never be repeated. For the first time in years, teams stopped treating documentation like paperwork. Instead, it became part of engineering. By the end of the first month, support tickets were already declining. Not because people worked harder, because they finally understood what they were supporting. Daniel attended almost every review meeting. He spoke less than before. Listened far more. One afternoon he stopped me after a planning session. I've been thinking about something you said. Which part? Experience explains why. I smiled. It does. I spent years believing every process could be optimized. It can. But not every process exists because someone enjoyed creating it. He nodded slowly. I've removed safeguards before simply because they looked unnecessary. Most people do. The difficult part is recognizing which safeguards were written in response to mistakes nobody remembers anymore. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally he admitted, I wish I'd asked more questions when I first arrived. So do I. The company gradually stabilized. Projects began finishing on schedule again. Customer complaints dropped. The delayed contract renewals were completed. Several clients even commented that communication had noticeably improved. The software itself hadn't changed very much. The people had. Managers started inviting engineers into planning meetings before making operational decisions. Support teams were encouraged to challenge assumptions instead of simply following instructions. When something failed, people focused less on finding someone to blame and more on understanding what had happened. It wasn't perfect. No company ever is. But it was moving in the right direction. About 6 weeks into my consulting agreement, Human Resources announced something unexpected. Atlas was launching a mentorship program for senior engineers. The goal wasn't management training. It wasn't leadership seminars. It was preserving institutional knowledge before it disappeared. Every experienced engineer would mentor at least one newer employee. Documentation would include recorded technical walkthroughs. Critical systems would always have backup owners. Nobody said the program existed because of what had happened to me. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew. One Friday afternoon, as I packed my laptop after another consulting session, I noticed a young software engineer waiting outside the conference room. She looked nervous. "Claire." "Yes. I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" "When you left." She hesitated. A lot of us realized how much knowledge we took for granted. She laughed softly. "I always assumed someone would know the answer. And now I'm trying to become someone who knows." That stayed with me long after I left the building. Titles disappear. Jobs change. Companies reorganize. But helping someone become better at their work, that lasts. At the end of the 90-day agreement, Daniel invited me to one final meeting. This one felt very different from the first. No HR representative. No termination paperwork. Just 2 cups of coffee sitting on the table. "I'd like to offer you your position back," he said. "Higher salary. Expanded authority. You could lead the entire engineering transformation." It was a generous offer. Months earlier I probably would have accepted without hesitation. Now, I simply smiled. "I appreciate it. But I'm going to decline." He looked disappointed though not surprised. "I thought you might. I loved working here." "I know. But sometimes the hardest lesson in a career is realizing you've already finished your chapter." He nodded. "What will you do instead?" "I've been getting calls from other companies. The same problem. Mostly. They don't need better software. They need better leadership around the people building it." For the first time since we'd met, Daniel laughed. "I believe that." 6 months later, I launched my own consulting practice. I worked with organizations that wanted to improve collaboration between technical teams and leadership. Not by cutting costs. Not by creating more meetings. By helping executives understand the people responsible for keeping their businesses running. Whenever a new client asked what qualified me for that work, I never mentioned being fired. I simply told them one lesson I'd learned after 11 years in one company. The most valuable employee is rarely the loudest person in the room. They're usually the one quietly solving problems before anyone else even realizes they exist. Some executives understood immediately. Others learned it the expensive way. Atlas did. And strangely enough, getting fired became one of the best things that ever happened to my career. Not because I proved someone wrong, but because it reminded me that real professional value isn't measured by a job title. It's measured by the problems only you know how to solve, and by your willingness to teach others before you walk away.